Hello and welcome everyone to this talk about Minjung Art, Images of Dissent. My name is Maya Stiller and I teach Korean art and culture at University of Kansas. Now a quick Minjung Art fact sheet. Just keep in mind while we talk about Minjung Art that this is a topic that is rarely discussed in South Korea or anywhere else in the world. It's not even discussed in textbooks in K-12 education in South Korea. And one of the most important events of the Minjung movement, of which Minjung Art is part of, is the Gwangju Uprising or Gwangju Revolt. And just keep in mind when we look at Minjung Art that there was an information ban on this event in the 1980s. So very few people knew it had happened. The Minjung activists who knew a little bit more about it and who criticized it in their artworks, many of these artists were actually imprisoned for doing that, and their art was confiscated. So Minjung art is not the type of art that you would have seen in an art gallery or in a museum, but it was art made for a purpose. It was utilitarian art, political art. And back in the 1980s, Minjung art was persecuted, and it still is a somewhat marginalized field in the larger field of Korean art history. Very few scholars actually research this topic. Now, why study Minjung art? In this talk, I will first give you a little overview of context of why we should study it, and then give you a couple of examples. Now, Korean soft power has been on the rise for the past 20 years, and it has reached unprecedented heights, particularly in the last couple of years, thanks to BTS and other K-pop bands, but also thanks to a very successful Korean film industry with the Oscar-winning movie Parasite and the very successful Netflix series Squid Game. And one of the reasons why these film productions drew global attention was that people all over the world could relate to the issues addressed in these films, which included social injustice, brutal competition, and economic inequality. South Korea from the 1960s to early 1990s was a completely different world, far from being the democratized, neoliberal consumer society that South Korea is today. And this slide depicts a rather disturbing photograph taken by a Korea Times reporter in 1986, when Lee Dong-soo, then a 21-year-old student, shouted, "Out with US imperialism and the police," before setting himself on fire and jumping from the 4th floor of a building at Seoul National University. Quite a few university students and laborers committed political suicide in the 1970s and 80s, as the table on the right shows. With all the hype surrounding K-pop and K-drama, etc., I believe it is important to remember that just 30, 40 years ago, laborers working in South Korean car manufacturing, shipbuilding, textile, and steel manufacturing industries faced exploitation, gender violence, low wages, and limited access to trade unions. South Korea back then was ruled by a dictatorial regime, and some of the liberties that we take for granted today, such as freedom of speech and free elections, did not exist. And these political suicides are not fiction like the murders and deaths are in Squid Game or Parasite. So imagine being so desperate about your country's political and economic situation that you are willing to kill yourself to bring attention to these issues. So this is just a basic timeline of the so-called Minjung movement. It's also referred to as the democratization movement of South Korea. It basically begins with the 1960s and ends in the early 1990s. And the Gwangju Uprising or Gwangju Revolt was a major catalyst for the Minjung movement. I would say the core time of the Minjung movement that we talk about mostly when we talk about Minjung art is the 1980s. And so I will mostly show works from the 1980s in this talk. And what were the goals of the 1980s Minjung movement? So first of all, it was free elections, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, workers' rights, reunification of the Korean Peninsula. As you can see on the left-hand side, I showed you a detail from Oh Yoon's Great Wish for Unification. So people, Minjung activists were really wishing for unification of the country, and they had different ideas of how to achieve that. And another major goal was liberation from US American cultural imperialism. Minjung activists were very anti-American, actually. So, and Minjung Art. So Minjung Art is basically the art that was produced for the Minjung movement. And so far it has been largely discussed in terms of like two-dimensional artworks, such as paintings and woodblock prints. But I actually have a more like expanded definition of Minjung art or Minjung misul, considering more like the spatial context of Minjung art, like where and how Minjung art was produced and used. And that encompasses not only two-dimensional artworks, but also performance art like theater or music, songs, documentary film, etc., etc. And aside from participating in demonstrations and committing suicide, what activists also did was they voiced their criticism through art. And novelists and poets were among the first artists to do that. They wrote about government-enforced relocations of poor neighborhoods for the sake of urbanization. They criticized wage exploitation and workers' poor living conditions. And Hwang Seok-young's Strange Land and On the Road to Sampo and Jo Se-hee's Little Ball Launched by a Dwarf are some of the most renowned Minjung literary works. And back then, these artists wrote and published at great personal risk. Hwang actually spent a couple of years in prison due to his political activities. And political activists also made film documentaries about the Minjung movement. Let me show you a quick clip from footage curated by two Minjung documentary film collectives and Haejong Park. So the first couple of seconds will show footage from demonstrations. You will hear a song played in the background that is a Minjung Gayo, a protest song that was typically sung during these demonstrations. And it talks about moving forward, creating a new world. The narrator also attempts to defend the demonstrators, claiming that they are not doing this to harm society, but rather to create a new society. And then in the second segment of this clip, you will see a torchlight performance in front of a large banner painting depicting two fierce-looking workers. And the performance culminates in the setting of torchlights to a slogan that says, "Liberation of the workers." So let's listen in and watch.
사회를 향한 문턱에 서 있다. 그들은 결코 편협하거나 파괴적이지 않다. 그들은 그들 앞에 놓인 계급적, 민족적 과제를 가장 실천적으로 알고 있으며 민족 해방과 민중 해방의 하나를 위한 지난한 투쟁에서 가장 거대한 힘을 발휘하고 있다.
Okay, so this footage exemplifies the powerful combination of visual art, music, and performance, all of which deserve scholarly attention, but only the visual art portion has been receiving the most attention so far. But seeing how all these various genres came together at a 현장, at a site of protest, clearly demonstrates that we should not prioritize the visual arts over other forms of art, and that we should take these other art forms into our study as well. So, Madangguk, which literally means theater performed in the yard, is another important element of Minjung art. It's a type of theater that was created by political activists in the 1970s as a form of social protest. Scholars such as Nami Lee refer to it as resistance theater, and I think that makes sense. By the 1980s, Madangguk had evolved into a utopian form of cultural and political expression. Almost every university in South Korea had a Madangguk performing group. And Madangguk was performed at university events, at festivals, at factories, in Protestant and Catholic churches, outdoor markets, basically everywhere. Madangguk performers combined traditional Korean pansori opera with mass dance theater elements, farmers' music, and they combined those traditional elements with Western, like elements from Western drama. And they performed these plays not on stage, but in open areas without their theatrical sets. And they also took well-known folk tales and legends and infused them with strong sociopolitical messages. So what you saw here was that's a picture taken in the 1980s, but Madangguk continued to be produced and composed throughout the 90s and even into the 2000s. So what you see here is Jeon Min-gyu's Nanjang, or Chaos. So that is a play that was created after the IMF crisis in 1997. So that addresses the problem of unemployment due to the IMF crisis. Another important aspect of Minjung art are activist songs, known in Korean as Minjung Gayo or Undongkwang Gayo. Because these songs contain politically charged content, they were heavily censored and could not be publicly performed. Minjung activists would illegally record these songs on cassette tapes and distribute them at gatherings. And they were sung during demonstrations, of course. And after Chun Doo-hwan's system of media control and censorship was abolished in 1987, some Minjung Gayo groups, such as 노래를 찾는 사람들, people seeking songs, released albums and actually became quite popular. But when 서태지와 아이들, 서태지 and all kinds of other teen pop emerged in the mid-1990s, and as you will soon learn in another lesson in this class, that was the beginning of K-pop, right? The mid-1990s. So when that happened, the Minjung singers kind of submerged into the indie scene around Hongik University. Now, An Chi-hwan's Pine Tree, Green Pine Tree, 설아 푸르는 설아, that's one of the most well-known Minjung Gayo. He composed this song in June 87, just a few days before the funeral of Lee Han-yeol, who was his Yonsei classmate. As we all know, Lee Han-yeol, he was hit by a tear gas canister in June 1987 during a demonstration on Yonsei campus, and then died a couple of days later. So there was a humongous funeral procession. And just a few days before that procession, An created the song. And it's based on a poem written in 1984 by Minjung poet Park Young-gun. As you can see from the content, Minjung artists kept the content of their works vague. As I said in the beginning of this lecture, you could not refer to any specific individuals or specific events, because if the songs had been more explicit, then the artist would have been immediately taken and interrogated by the police. So in a nutshell, this song acknowledges the hardship and the sorrow that the Korean people were going through as a result of the authoritarian regime. And there's also a positive note at the end. It encourages people to overcome any obstacles and keep moving forward. So in the first line and the fifth line, An refers to a strong wind, which clearly represents the authoritarian regime that the Minjung are subjected to. And then in the first line, the phrase mother's tears refers to the many mothers who lost their sons and daughters who died during police interrogation, in prison, and so on. In the third line, An expresses the hope that one day the people will be free of the dictatorship. In the fourth line, he indirectly refers to police violence, but he uses the metaphor of rowing out of the rough currents to indicate that, let's get through this, and there is a way out of this. The pine tree mentioned in the title and in the fifth line, that represents the Minjung. Because the pine tree is an evergreen tree. It remains green and alive in the winter. It survives heavy snowstorms. So it's implying that the Minjung will survive no matter what, even in difficult times. And then in the final line, the bars, the changsal, can mean different things to different people. For a dissident student, it can refer to prison bars, but it could also refer to other things that tie people down. And then the song ends with an encouragement to hang in there, stay alive, and one day reunite with family and comrades. So now that I have explained the song's content, it's time to listen in. So let me just show you. I'm just going to play a quick snippet from a video. This is a recording from 2019, I believe. Since graduating from Yonsei in the late 1980s, An Chi-wan has actually had a successful career as a songwriter and singer. So, listen in.
거센 바람이 불어와서 어머님의 눈물이 가슴 속에 사무쳐오는 갈라진 이 세상에 주의 넘친 주인되는 참 세상 자유를 위하여 시퍼렇게 숨을 들어도 강물처 가리라 소라 소라 푸른 소라 새바람에 떨지 마라 창살 아래 네가 웃긴 것 살아서만 내리라.
Okay, moving on. So we discussed Madangguk, we discussed songs, Minjung Gayo, protest songs, and in the documentary footage that we saw earlier, there were the performers dancing in front of a very tall banner painting, right? And this painting here, that you can see on this slide, is titled "Relieving the Suffering of the Joseon People," and that's just another excellent example of this type of painting, which is known as golge kurim in Korean, or banner painting. The Minjung artist collective Durong, which literally means ridge between rice fields, created this piece in 1984. It contains multiple narrative vignettes that illustrate the past, present, and the future of the Korean people. And I would like to use this painting to highlight the core message that the Minjung artists were trying to convey in their works. In terms of size and material, the Durong Artist Collective were inspired by Korean painting traditions, such as the tradition of large Buddhist banner paintings called kaebul that are used during Buddhist outdoor ceremonies. And so like a Buddhist kaebul, this golge-gerim is quite large. It measures 2.5 by 1.5 meters. And Durong also used the same kind of bright mineral colors that were traditionally used to decorate the pillars and eaves of Korean architecture, in Korean architecture. The painting can be divided into an upper and a lower section, linked by a flow of human figures that represent the flow of time moving from the lower left to the upper section. And toward the central message of the painting, which is basically around here, you can see that the scale of the figures becomes larger and more detailed. And I would suggest that we enter the painting at the bottom. The central scene at the lower edge, framed by 2 men in kangs, depicts 7 men hanging from the gallows, dressed in traditional Korean garb. This scene alludes to the Dongguk peasant rebellion of 1894, which served as a source of inspiration for many Minjung activists. Moving up, we have another scene of violence above a row of flickering flames. We got white-haired men dressed in black and olive green uniforms. They are shown arguing and beating each other. And one of them actually appears to be firing a gun at a person that is lifting their arms and like holding a stone in their right fist. And then we have 2 rows of people that seem to be kneeling down, and this kind of squatting down and having their arms tied to a rope. If we look at this picture, that's basically a scene taken during the Gwangju Revolt in 1980. This photograph captures a similar moment, basically when arrested students were tied to a rope and then being taken away by the army. And so what this vignette here does is it refers to the pervasive police violence in 1970s and 1980s Korea, which was marked by brutal clashes between police forces and dissident students and laborers, as well as their imprisonment and torture. So moving up to the sides of the middle section, we see 2 vignettes on the painting's left and right-hand side. And on the left, we see farmers plowing a field in front of an urban landscape with tall buildings and smoking chimneys, a reference to urbanization and migration into the cities. And on the right, we see a blue ocean with, full of Western influences entering Korea, including various consumer items and licentious behavior. And then moving to the central part of the painting, we see the transformation of the Korean people from a suffering people to a happy people. The focal point is a coffin around which the family members are sitting in grief. And this is a common motive in Minjung art that was used as a reference to the Gwangju uprising. Essentially, the message here is that based on the suffering and the sacrifices of the Korean people, I mean, you can see people down below here, like digging graves for the people that died during the Gwangju uprising. So whether it's the peasants who died during the Dongguk Peasant Rebellion or the citizens who were killed during the Gwangju uprising, the Minjung of today will develop a communal spirit that will help them overcome their oppression and move into a better, brighter future. And that better and brighter future is shown in the upper section of this painting, where we see well-nourished, smiling individuals of all ages dance and sing and play traditional Korean farmers' music. And this upper section is framed by 2 pine trees, a motif discussed earlier, right? When we talked about An Si-hwan's Green Pine Tree song. So pine trees traditionally represent longevity. So if you look into like Joseon period landscape painting, we frequently encounter a pine tree. But in the context of the Minjung movement, they were given the additional meaning of representing the Minjung or the people's enduring spirit. Many Minjung activists actually wished for the society to return to its roots, to live in harmony with nature. And, they wanted a de-Westernized cultural identity. They wanted a society free of overconsumption and US American cultural influence. But later on, starting in like the mid-90s, Minjung activists were criticized for having done that, for having had a too utopian vision of the past, romanticizing pre-modern Korea. and you know, they were criticized basically for thinking backward and not forward. Yes, but I think we should give credit to the Minjung artists for doing basically two things, among many other things. They uneducated and they self-educated themselves. So artists like the Duron Collective basically uneducated themselves of the modernist abstraction and the individual authorship that they had been taught at art school. And here we see, for example, Park So-bo's Écriture from 1978, and EU Fan's from Line, also 1978. So these were the types of artworks that were shown in commercial art galleries at the time. And yeah, that's basically what Minjung artists had to uneducate themselves from. And then Minjung artists had to self-educate themselves in traditional techniques that were actually not taught in art school. These were techniques that, you know, some things like woodblock printing, for example, or how to paint a Buddhist banner painting. These were things that Minjung activists or Minjung artists learned directly by like visiting artists in the countryside, and or just self-teaching, like teaching themselves. And we see this with a lot of like woodblock prints that were very popular among a certain section of Minjung artists because they were easy, you know, the material was accessible, it was easy to reproduce these pieces so they could be disseminated quickly and easily. And of course you have this reference to like traditional painting forms, such as this kind of banner painting that comes from the Buddhist tradition. So what is going on with Minjung art today? Well, most Minjung artists would no longer call themselves Minjung artists, but there's one artist, Hong Song-dam, who was there in Gwangju when the Gwangju revolt or uprising occurred, and he actually helped the Minjung activists, you know, by reproducing slogans, etc. So he was right in the middle of everything, and I could probably talk about Hong Song-dam in a separate lecture because he did so many things in the 1980s that was related to the Minjung movement, eventually leading to his imprisonment in the late 1980s. At any rate, so what he did in 2014, way before the candlelight demonstrations that led to the impeachment of Park Geun-hye, he created this large banner painting that shows Park Geun-hye as a scarecrow, and she's basically held by by her father. So that was an art piece that brought a lot of criticism. Like this artwork was discussed in the media in 2014, and yeah, police came to his apartment, and there was a lot of, yeah, you can look it up online if you read Korean. Just look up this Sewol Owol art piece, and you will find a lot of controversial like debates about this artwork. So in conclusion, Minjung art is a very crucial part of post-1945 Korean art history. It is utilitarian art, so it was not the type of like visual art that was made for display in galleries, like the works by Park So-bo or Yu Fan that we saw earlier. But these were pieces that were made for sites of protest, and they include not just beautiful two-dimensional artworks, but they include sound, performance, literature, all kinds of things. And I'm particularly intrigued by the cross-references between different art forms. For instance, the pine tree that we see occur in An Xi-hwan's song, but also in the painting that we looked at. And you know, what remains of the Minjung movement or Minjung art today? Well, actually a lot more than you might expect. So I think we have to give some credit to the Minjung activists and the Minjung artists for South Korea's development into a more democratized country. Of course, we can discuss to what extent South Korea is a democratized country. And then there are some Minjung activists who are still active, like Hong Song-dam. And I believe that South Koreans still have a very strong political awareness for social injustice. And we can see this throughout 20th century history. And the candlelight demonstrations of 2016-17 are just another great example for that. In these demonstrations, basically 1/3 of the South Korean population, like 60 million people, participated, and that led to the impeachment of President Park Geun-hye. So yeah, there is basically political awareness, and there are demonstrations still going on in Korea, but there are the people participating in these demonstrations are, it's broader. It's more like general, like citizens, and not just the intellectual elite, the students or the workers, like in the 1980s, but it's much broader than that. And also, if we look at the people who start calling for demonstrations, it's mostly through the internet. It's through online announcements on bulletin boards, et cetera, et cetera. So it kind of has shifted to different ways to start a protest. So that's very different from the 1980s in terms of the type of people who participate, the number of people who participate. It has become more accepted in society to participate in demonstrations, etc. I mean, we could talk about this for hours. So thank you for your time. I hope this was useful, helpful for you to understand Minjung Art. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at this email address. Thank you so much.